I was in LA for a foray, and I was wandering around in one of the canyons looking for mushrooms. Two people came up to me and they said, do you know Garego Lincoffa? And they said, well, they needed Garego Lincoffa to help them find the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, which they knew grew in that canyon. They were preparing themselves to leave the planet. And they said, well, they thought the muscaria, the fly agaric, would show them the way. They continued to talk, and I told them, that's who I was. And the one guy says, listen, you have to come over to my place, and I've got something I really have to share with you. So I had the night free, and I went over. So I walked into this guy's house, and I was a little nervous because I didn't know them. And he has a refrigerator full of drugs. I mean, like, he didn't have any normal food, like no loaf of bread, no butter, nothing, just drugs. And he had a couple eggs. And he had guns all over his wall. Now, I live in New York City, and that's not the sort of thing we have on our wall. We're not supposed to have handguns. Plus, there were a lot of dogs in the neighborhood barking their heads off, and they sounded angry. So this was, like, not a good scene. But he said, you're here, and you have to share this with us. So he makes up this thing with magic mushrooms, which I had not had, and I eat them, and then he sits me down on a sofa, and he says, just stare at me. And his entire living room, within a half an hour, turned from a multicolor into a kind of a desert gray. And he turned into a wolf, sitting there staring at me. He said, you look apprehensive. Is there a problem? And I said, I couldn't begin to tell you what the problem is, but I was thinking, this is the last day of my life, and this is like ending. He said, just like, let it go. And not being prepared for what was to come, I eventually relaxed. He said, do you see a light? And I said, yes. He says, what color is it? And I said, white. He said, well, are you going to follow it? I said, do I have a choice? And he said, well, that's what you should do. And then the roof opens up over my head, and before I know it, I'm out of my body, and I'm not floating, I'm actually moving. So I follow this thing out, and we are going out into outer space, and somewhere near what he said must have been the Andromeda Galaxy, I was getting cold, and he said, well, why don't you stop by the fire? He said, well, there's a fireplace out there. Okay. So I found it and sat there. I got warm. And I kept traveling. And after, I don't know how many hours, he said, do you want to come back? And I was thinking, well, it's really nice out here. Why would I want to go back? But he thought it was a good idea. And so I started coming back, and re-entry wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. And there was LA, and then there was this street. And there was this one house with a big hole in its roof. And I said, that must be where I go. And I looked down, and sure enough, there I was sitting on the sofa. And it was just a matter of getting whatever it was of me out there back into that body. And that was essentially the whole night. And he wasn't a shaman, he wasn't a healer, he wasn't some kind of mystic guide. He was just a guy who was in the mountains who had this predilection for using a refrigerator full of drugs, and he had one he wanted to share with me, hoping, I think, to get me to join them to leave the planet, which I wasn't ready to do, because I wasn't sure they had a real good game plan. Now, hey, that might be an interesting thing. Could you go through a wormhole with the mushroom and find yourself on a planet like Earth? It sounds like fantasy, whatever, but as I keep telling people, yesterday's science fiction is today's science, and things that we didn't think were possible are possible. It's just a matter of partially technology, but largely imagination.
One side will make you grow taller. The other side will make you grow shorter.
One side of what?
The mushroom.
Which side will make me grow larger?
The large-making side, of course.
I'll take a little of both to make sure. Mr. Caterpillar, sir, where are you?
You know, it's hard to think about mushrooms in a rational way because everywhere you look, they seem to exude mystery. You look at a lawn and you see a ring of mushrooms, and you know, we call that a fairy ring. Where does that come from? Well, the idea at night, midnight, there are fairies dancing in circles. And in the daytime, when you can't see them, there's a ring of mushrooms, which we call the fairy ring. This leads to a whole mythology about mushrooms and fairies and the little people, and this is almost like an alternate world living right along with us. Those of us who spend a lot of time with mushrooms worry about is we end up with a kind of a mycocentric view of the universe. Everything can be explained by mushrooms or with mushrooms, so that it's hard to look at Santa Claus and not see, gee, this guy who looks like a fly agaric with these reindeer riding across the sky. Surely that must have been inspired by the use of fly agaric mushrooms and reindeer in the Arctic, and it makes sense. And then we find other things, and we say, gee, it all fits together, and it can all be, the whole world can be explained by mushrooms, and all major religions can be explained by the use of mushrooms.
I'm puzzled. Are you really seriously suggesting that Jesus Christ was a mushroom?
Put pretty blankly, yes.
Surely you don't suggest that Jesus Christ and his various disciples were not human creatures.
Yes. You are dealing with a secret cult, a secret society. The stories of the New Testament contain certain incantations, certain magic names, which were really the names of the mushroom.
No, but the writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these men who wrote the story, you are telling me they did not exist?
No.
None of them existed?
No, it's part of mythology. It's part of mushroom mythology.
Some of them